Han Suk-jin didn't fear death, he owned it. The razor-sharp crease of his tuxedo was as lethal as the silenced Glock tucked against his ribs. But standing in the center of the grand ballroom, the crystal flute in his hand felt heavier than a lead casket. He was seconds away from drinking to a new era of the Han Empire. His brother, Dongwook, stood opposite him, a mask of familial pride stretched across his face. Suk-jin raised the glass, the dark liquid swirling like a whirlpool of blood. Before the rim could touch his teeth, a hand, small, trembling, yet unbreakable, clamped onto his wrist. It was Ji-yu, the clumsy, seasonal waitress who had been invisible all night. Her eyes, usually lowered in subservience, were now burning with a desperate, terrifying lucidity. She didn't apologize. She didn't recoil. She leaned in, her whisper cold enough to freeze the champagne in the room. "Don't drink, Mr. Han. Unless you want your heart to stop before you hit the floor." In Suk-jin's world, a waitress didn't touch the king. He was a second away from snapping her wrist, but the sheer, clinical calm in her gaze made the Iron King freeze. "What did you say?" he hissed, his voice a low vibration of impending violence. Ji-yu didn't blink. "Your brother didn't pour wine. He poured a death sentence." She jerked him toward the service exit with a strength that didn't match her frame. "Just watch. 10 seconds. Look at the dog." Through the service door's porthole, Suk-jin saw his brother drop a piece of steak soaked in the spilled wine to the floor. The syndicate's guard dog, a 100-pound Belgian Malinois, snapped it up. 10 seconds later, the animal collapsed without a whimper. The killer's instinct flooded Suk-jin's veins. He lunged for the door, his hand reaching for the steel at his hip to paint the ballroom red with his brother's blood. Ji-yu slammed him back against the cold industrial fridge, her body a literal shield. "Not yet," she pleaded, her voice a raw, professional rasp. "If you kill him now, the board sees a madman murdering his heir. You become the villain. He's already filed the accidental heart failure paperwork, Mr. Han. He wants you to react." She pulled a tablet from her apron, its screen glowing with the blue light of a hidden lab feed. "I've been tracking the shipments for months," she said. "He isn't just poisoning your glass. He's been poisoning your life." The silver key felt heavy and cold in Suk-jin's palm, like a small, frozen scepter. In the quiet of the underground VIP parking lot, the only sound was the rhythmic click of his Italian leather shoes against the smooth concrete. It was 3 a.m., and the world above was asleep, but Suk-jin's day was just beginning. To everyone else, he was the Iron King of the Seoul underworld. To himself, he was something more. A man who had outsmarted death so many times that he no longer believed in it. He adjusted the cuff of his dark suit, feeling the familiar weight of the Glock tucked against his ribs. He had just finished a meeting where he had crushed a rival's spirit without even raising his voice. Power was a drug, and Suk-jin was the city's biggest dealer. He looked at the black Mercedes-Benz S-Class waiting for him under the flickering fluorescent lights. The car was a beast of steel and glass, armored to withstand bullets and grenades. It was his mobile fortress, a symbol of a life where nothing was left to chance. As he walked, Suk-jin's mind raced through the details of the upcoming summit. He thought about the men who would sit across from him, men who called themselves bosses, but were really just scavengers waiting for him to drop a crumb. He smiled a thin, dangerous smile. 10 years ago, he was a street soldier with nothing but a knife and a dream. Now he owned the docks, the warehouses, and the very ground he walked on. He felt invincible. He felt like a god in a world of mortals. The silence of the garage was comforting. It was a place where he could finally think without the noise of his bodyguards or the ringing of his phones. He reached the driver's side door, the silver key glinting one last time before he prepared to slide it into the lock. He didn't check the corners. He didn't look under the chassis. Why would he? His driver, Choi Dae, had been with him for a decade. His security team had swept the area an hour ago. In Suk-jin's mind, he was the most protected man in the country. He was so wrapped up in his own glory that he didn't notice the small shadow shifting behind a concrete pillar. He didn't see the tiny pair of pink sneakers peeking out from behind a stack of tires. He was a lion entering his den, unaware that the floor was rigged to collapse. His fingers touched the cold metal of the door handle, ready to pull and start the engine that would carry him toward his next victory. He was exactly where his enemies wanted him to be, trapped by his own pride. The cold metal of the door handle was just inches from Sukjin's fingers when the silence of the garage shattered. A flash of bright pink burst from behind the heavy concrete pillar. Before he could react, a small figure lunged forward, throwing her entire weight against the black paint of the Mercedes. "Don't start it," the girl screamed. Her voice was high and thin, echoing off the low ceiling like a siren. Sukjin froze, his hand hovering in midair. He looked down in total shock. A young girl, no older than 6 or 7, stood between him and his car door. She wore a puffy pink coat and white leggings, her hair tied in 2 messy pigtails. Her chest was heaving, and her tiny hands were pressed flat against the window, as if she were trying to hold back a tidal wave. For a second, the Iron King was speechless. He was a man who dealt with assassins and backstabbers, not children in pigtails. His first feeling was a wave of hot anger. How did a kid get past his elite security? Who did she think she was, stopping the most powerful man in Seoul? "Move, kid," Sukjin hissed, his voice dropping into a deadly low growl. He reached out to grab her shoulder and pull her away, but the girl didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up at him with eyes that were wide and filled with a watery, desperate terror. "Please," she sobbed, her finger pointing urgently toward the bottom of the car. "I saw him. I saw your driver. He put something under the seat. A black box with blinking lights. He said it would go boom when you turn the key." The air in Sukjin's lungs turned to ice. He stopped reaching for her and followed her trembling finger. He looked at the gap between the car and the concrete floor. Deep in the shadows of the undercarriage, he saw a thin red wire peeking out from a metal casing. It was a pressure-sensitive bomb. The girl's words hit him harder than any bullet ever could. His driver. Choi Dae, the man who had driven him to every meeting for a decade. The man who knew his children's birthdays and his favorite coffee. Sukjin's survival instinct kicked in. He slowly raised his head, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the garage. About 50 feet away, near a flickering light, a shadow moved. It was a man in a gray jacket and a black baseball cap. The man wasn't running. He was watching, waiting for the explosion that would end the Han Empire. As the figure stepped slightly into the light, Sukjin recognized the cold, calculating eyes of Choi Dae. The driver wasn't waiting to open the door for his boss. He was waiting to watch him die. Sukjin felt a surge of molten rage, but then he looked back at the little girl in the pink coat. She was shaking, her small body pressed against the very car that was now a ticking coffin. In an instant, the world's most dangerous man realized he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey, and his only ally was a child who shouldn't even be there. Sukjin moved slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't want to believe the girl, but the terror in her eyes was too real to ignore. He knelt on the cold, greasy concrete, his expensive suit trousers soaking up the oil from the garage floor. He didn't care about the clothes anymore. He leaned his head down, squinting into the dark space beneath the heavy black car. There it was. Tucked behind the front tire, hidden by the shadows of the frame, was a small black plastic box. It was held in place by strong magnets. A single red wire ran from the box directly into the car's engine block. A tiny red light on the side of the device blinked steadily, like a slow, rhythmic heartbeat. It was a pressure plate bomb. The moment he sat in the driver's seat and turned the key, the electrical spark would send a signal to the box, and the Mercedes would become a ball of fire. Sukjin stared at the blinking light, and for the first time in his life, his breath hitched. He wasn't just looking at a weapon, he was looking at a decade of lies. Choi Dae had been his shadow. He had stood by Sukjin during gang wars and silent negotiations. He had held the umbrella over Sukjin's head during rainstorms. The betrayal felt sharper than a knife in his back. It was a cold, hollow realization that emptied his chest. Every secret he had told in the back seat, every person he had mentioned, and every plan he had whispered, Choi Dae had heard it all. The The man wasn't just a driver. He was a spy who had been waiting for the right price to sell Suk-jin's life. Trust, the one thing Suk-jin thought he could buy with money and power, had turned out to be a ghost. It's real, isn't it?
Y9 sperred.
She was still standing by the door, her small hands trembling. Suk-jin stood up slowly, his face turning into a mask of cold stone. The shock was gone, replaced by a freezing, calculated rage. He looked at the girl in the pink coat. She had no reason to save him. In his world, people only did things for a reward, yet this child had risked her life to stop a monster from stepping into a trap. He glanced back toward the flickering light where the shadow had moved. Choi Dae was still there, lurking in the darkness, likely wondering why the car hadn't exploded yet. Suk-jin reached into his jacket and gripped the handle of his gun. The Iron King was back, but he was different now. He wasn't just fighting for his empire anymore. He was fighting to get this girl out of the line of fire. He grabbed Ji-yu's hand. Her skin was ice cold. "Don't look back," he commanded in a low, firm voice. "And don't let go of my hand. We're leaving." The silence of the garage was about to end, and Suk-jin knew that the man in the gray jacket wouldn't let them walk away without a fight. The red wire had severed his past life, and now, the only way out was through the shadows. Suk-jin moved like a shadow, pulling Ji-yu away from the black Mercedes. His eyes never left the flickering light where he had seen the driver. The silence of the garage suddenly felt heavy and dangerous. Every drop of water hitting the floor sounded like a footstep. He knew Choi Dae was out there, watching and waiting. The driver knew the plan had failed because the car was still silent and dark. In the distance, the man in the gray jacket stepped fully into the light. He didn't look like the loyal servant Suk-jin had known for 10 years. His face was cold, and his eyes were filled with a sharp, hungry look. When he saw Suk-jin walking away with the girl, he didn't run. Instead, he reached into his jacket with a slow, calm movement. He pulled out a black handgun and leveled it toward them. "Get down," Suk-jin barked, shoving Ji-yu behind a thick concrete pillar just as the first shot rang out. The sound was deafening. It bounced off the low ceiling and the concrete walls, echoing over and over. A spark flew off the metal side of a nearby van, leaving a jagged white scar in the paint. Ji-yu let out a small, terrified sob and curled into a ball, covering her ears with her hands. Her pink coat was a bright target against the gray concrete, and Suk-jin knew he had to move her fast. Suk-jin pulled his own weapon, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He fired back twice, the muzzle flashes lighting up the dark garage for a split second. He wasn't trying to kill Choi Dae yet. He just needed to keep the traitor's head down. "Stay behind me," Suk-jin commanded. He kept his body between the girl and the direction of the bullets. For years, Suk-jin had been the predator. He was the one who sent men into the shadows to do his dirty work. Now, the roles had flipped. He was trapped in a basement with a bomb on one side and an assassin on the other. He felt the sting of a concrete chip hitting his cheek, but he didn't flinch. He looked at the exit sign at the far end of the lot, but it felt miles away. Choi Dae fired again, the bullet whistling past Suk-jin's ear and shattering the glass of a fire extinguisher cabinet. White powder began to hiss out, creating a cloud of smoke that blurred the air. Suk-jin grabbed Ji-yu's arm, lifting her up so they could run. "We have to move now," he hissed. They lunged into the white mist, the sound of Choi Dae's heavy boots clicking on the floor behind them. The Iron King was no longer thinking about his empire or his money. He was thinking about the warmth of the small hand gripping his, and the fact that he was the only thing standing between a brave little girl and a cold-blooded killer. The hunt had begun, and the garage had become a maze of death. The white powder from the broken fire extinguisher filled the air like a thick fog. Suk-jin used the blur to pull Ji-yu toward a row of metal storage lockers built into the back wall of the garage. He found one with a broken latch and shoved the heavy door open. It groaned on its hinges, but the sound was covered by the distant, steady footsteps of Choi Dae. "Get in." Quietly, Suk-jin whispered. He bundled the girl inside and stepped in after her, pulling the door shut until only a tiny crack of light remained. The locker was cramped and smelled of old rubber and cold metal. Inside the darkness, Ji-Yu's breathing was fast and shallow. Suk-jin pressed his back against the vibrating metal wall, his gun held tight against his chest. He could feel the girl shaking next to him. "He's coming," she breathed, her voice barely a ghost of a sound. "I know," Suk-jin replied. He watched the crack in the door. He saw the beam of a flashlight sweep across the floor outside. The light was steady and slow. Choi Dae was hunting them like a professional, checking behind every pillar and under every car. To keep her calm, Suk-jin looked down at the small girl. Her pink coat was covered in gray dust from the floor. "Why were you even out here, Ji-Yu? A garage at 3 in the morning is no place for a kid." Ji-Yu wiped her nose with the back of her hand. Her eyes looked huge in the dim light. "I was looking for my dad," she whispered. "He didn't come home last week. He works for the men in the big office. He told me if he ever went missing, I should look for the black cars with the silver lion on the front." Suk-jin felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silver lion was his personal emblem. He realized then that her father was likely one of the low-level workers his organization had cleaned up during the recent merger. This little girl wasn't just a random bystander. She was a victim of the very empire he had built with blood and fear. "I hid behind the tires to wait for him," she continued, her voice trembling. "That's when I saw the man in the hat. He didn't see me. He was laughing while he put the wires under your car." Suk-jin closed his eyes for a second. He had spent his whole life thinking that people were just chess pieces to be moved or discarded. But here was a child he had indirectly hurt, and she was the only reason he was still breathing. She was looking for a father who was probably gone forever, and yet she had stopped to save the man responsible for the world she lived in. Outside, the footsteps stopped right in front of their locker. The flashlight beam hit the metal door, shining through the crack and landing right on Suk-jin's eye. He held his breath, his finger tightening on the trigger. The silence was so heavy it felt like it might break the locker apart. The light from the flashlight stayed on the locker door for a long, terrifying moment. Suk-jin could hear Choi Dae's slow, steady breathing on the other side of the thin metal. He pressed his hand against Ji-Yu's shoulder, signaling her to stay absolutely still. The girl was like a statue, her eyes locked on the sliver of light. Suk-jin knew he couldn't hide forever. If Choi Dae opened the door, they were trapped in a metal box with nowhere to run. He needed a ghost to pull the killer away. Keeping his gun aimed at the door with his right hand, Suk-jin used his left to slowly pull his smartphone from his pocket. He turned the brightness all the way down so the glow wouldn't give them away. With a few quick taps, he opened a special app designed for his armored Mercedes. It was a high-tech security system that allowed him to control the car from a distance. He didn't start the engine. That would trigger the bomb. Instead, he found the button for the panic alarm and the emergency lighting. He waited until he heard Choi Dae take a step closer to their locker, the metal creaking under the weight of the trader's hand. Suk-jin tapped the screen. Suddenly, the far end of the garage exploded with noise and light. The Mercedes began to scream, its horn honking in a loud, rhythmic pattern. The headlights and taillights flashed like strobe lights, bouncing off the concrete walls and cutting through the smoky mist. The sound was so loud it made the floor vibrate. Choi Dae spun around, startled by the sudden chaos. To him, it looked like Suk-jin was making a run for the car or using a remote to mess with the electronics. The trader didn't hesitate. He sprinted away from the lockers, heading back toward the noise with his gun raised. "Now," Suk-jin whispered, grabbing Ji-Yu's hand and pushing the locker door open. They slipped out into the shadows, moving in the opposite direction of the flashing lights. The loud honking drowned out the sound of their footsteps. Suk-jin kept low, guiding Ji-Yu behind a row of parked SUVs. Every time the car horn blasted, they took a few more fast steps toward the exit ramp. Ji-Yu stumbled once, but Suk-jin caught her before she hit the ground. He looked back and saw Choi Dae standing by the Mercedes, looking confused and angry as he realized the car was empty. The distraction had worked, but it wouldn't last long. Suk-jin's heart pounded as he saw the faint glow of the streetlights at the top of the ramp. They were close to the surface, but the garage was still a cage, and the hunter was about to realize he had been tricked by a machine. The cool air from the exit ramp brushed against Sukjin's face, but the safety of the street felt 1,000 miles away. They were halfway up the concrete slope when a shot rang out, much closer than before. The bullet hit a metal pipe above their heads, showering them with sparks and rusty water. Choi Dae had stopped chasing the car and had seen their shadows moving toward the light. "Run!" Sukjin shouted, pushing Ji-yu ahead of him. Another shot followed. Sukjin felt a sharp, hot sting across his shoulder, followed by a wet warmth that quickly soaked through his white shirt and dark suit jacket. He let out a choked gasp but didn't stop. He couldn't afford to fall. If he went down, Ji-yu would be alone with a man who killed for sport. He gritted his teeth, the pain flaring like a torch against his skin, but he kept his gun steady, firing back into the darkness to force Choi Dae to take cover. They dove behind a heavy concrete barrier near the top of the ramp. Sukjin leaned his back against the wall, breathing hard. He looked down at his arm. The blood was dark and thick, staining the intricate ink of the dragon tattoo that wrapped around his forearm. The dragon looked like it was swimming in a red sea. "You're bleeding," Ji-yu whispered, her eyes filling with tears. She reached out with a trembling hand, but Sukjin shook his head. "It's just a scratch," he lied, though his head was starting to swim. As he leaned back, a crumpled piece of paper fell out of his pocket. It was a file he had taken from Choi Dae's glove box weeks ago, but had never bothered to read. In the dim light of the exit, he saw a name scribbled on the back in Choi Dae's messy handwriting. It was the name of the chemical company where Ji-yu's father had worked. Next to it was a dollar amount and the word eliminated. The truth hit Sukjin harder than the bullet. Choi Dae hadn't just betrayed him tonight. The driver had been working for the rival syndicate, the Shadow Group, for months. They were the ones who had ordered the kidnapping of Ji-yu's father to steal his formulas, and Choi Dae had been the one to help them hide the evidence. Sukjin looked at the little girl. He felt a sudden, crushing weight of guilt. He had built a world so violent and cold that it had swallowed her father whole, and he had trusted the very monster who had done the deed. Choi Dae wasn't just a traitor to the Han Empire. He was the man who had stolen this child's future. "I'm sorry, Ji-yu," Sukjin muttered, his voice raspy.
For what? She asked.
"For everything," he replied. He looked down the ramp. He could hear Choi Dae's boots clicking as he slowly climbed toward them, confident that his boss was too weak to fight back. Sukjin tightened his grip on his weapon. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for justice for the girl in the pink coat. The footsteps on the ramp grew louder, slow and steady. Choi Dae was not in a hurry. He knew Sukjin was hurt and trapped. Sukjin leaned against the cold concrete barrier, his shoulder throbbing with every beat of his heart. He looked at Ji-yu, who was huddled in the shadows. He had to end this now, or neither of them would see the sunrise. "Choi Dae," Sukjin shouted, his voice echoing through the garage. "You were always a better driver than a soldier. You missed my heart." The footsteps stopped. A cold laugh came from the darkness below. "I wasn't aiming for your heart, boss. I wanted you to feel it coming. You lived like a king while we did the dirty work. Now, the Shadow Group is paying me to be the king." As Choi Dae spoke, he stepped into the light. In his left hand, he held a small, black remote with a single glass-covered button. It was the detonator for the bomb under the Mercedes. In his right hand, he held his gun. He was playing a game, enjoying the power he finally had over the man he used to serve. "Give me the girl, Sukjin," Choi Dae said, his eyes narrowing. "She's a witness. You know how the business works. No loose ends." "The business is over," Sukjin replied. In one sudden movement, Sukjin didn't fire his gun. Instead, he threw a heavy metal tool he had grabbed from the floor earlier. It hissed through the air, clattering loudly against a nearby car. Choi Dae flinched, his eyes darting toward the noise for a split second. That was all the time Sukjin needed. Sukjin lunged forward, ignoring the burning pain in his shoulder. He slammed into Choi Dae with the force of a falling building. The two men crashed to the concrete floor, rolling in the grit and oil. Sukjin didn't go for the gun. He grabbed Choi Dae's left wrist. He squeezed with all his remaining strength until he heard a satisfying crack. Choi Dae let out a howl of pain, and the black remote slipped from his fingers, sliding across the floor toward the edge of the ramp. Both men scrambled for it, but Suk-jin was faster. He kicked Choi Dae in the chest, sending him gasping backward, and lunged for the device. His fingers closed around the cold plastic just as Choi Dae raised his gun. "Drop it," Suk-jin roared, pointing his own weapon at the traitor's head while clutching the detonator in his blood-stained hand. Choi Dae froze, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the remote in Suk-jin's hand, then at the man he had betrayed. The power had shifted again. Suk-jin stood up slowly, his face like a mask of iron. He wasn't just holding a trigger, he was holding the life and death of everyone in that garage. Behind him, Ji-yu watched from the shadows, her eyes wide as she realized the monster who took her father was finally cornered. The air in the garage was thick with the smell of gasoline and cold betrayal. Choi Dae stared at the barrel of Suk-jin's gun, his face pale and sweating. He looked down at the remote in Suk-jin's hand, then back at the man he had tried to kill. He knew he had lost. In the silence, the only sound was the faint beep of the car alarm still echoing from below. "You won't do it," Choi Dae whispered, his voice shaking. "You love that car more than anything. And the explosion, it will bring the police. You'll lose your empire." Suk-jin looked at the remote, then at the blood soaking his sleeve. Finally, he looked at Ji-yu. She was standing by the concrete pillar, her small pink coat stained with dust, her eyes full of a sadness no child should ever know. He realized that his empire was already gone. It had been built on the backs of people like Ji-yu's father, and it had almost cost him his own life. "I'm not the man I was 10 minutes ago," Suk-jin said. His voice was as cold as a winter grave. "You thought you were killing a boss, but you just woke up a father." With a steady thumb, Suk-jin flipped the glass cover on the remote and pressed the button. A second of pure silence followed. Then, the ground beneath them groaned. A massive, orange fireball erupted from the center of the garage, shaking the entire building. The Mercedes, the symbol of Suk-jin's old power, was torn apart in a roar of heat and metal. The shockwave knocked Choi Dae off his feet, sending him tumbling back into the darkness. Thick, black smoke began to billow up the ramp, swallowing the traitor and his broken dreams. Suk-jin didn't wait to see what happened next. He turned his back on the fire and reached out his hand. Ji-yu took it, her tiny fingers disappearing into his large, scarred palm. He pulled her close as they walked out of the garage and into the cool, morning air of Seoul. The sun was just beginning to peek over the skyscrapers, painting the city in shades of gold. Suk-jin's black car was gone. His driver was a memory, and his suit was ruined. But as he stood on the sidewalk, he felt a new kind of strength. He pulled out his phone and made one last call to his remaining captains. "Listen closely," he commanded, his voice carrying over the sound of distant sirens. "The old rules are dead. From today on, the Han Syndicate has a new law. We don't touch the innocent. We don't leave children behind. And if anyone breaks that rule, they will wish they had died in that garage." He looked down at Ji-yu and gave her a small, tired smile. He couldn't bring her father back, but he could make sure the world was safer for her. The Iron King was gone, but a new kind of leader had risen from the smoke. Together, the man in the bloody suit and the girl in the pink coat walked away from the shadows, leaving the fire behind them.